Hey y'all, it's Laura, and I'm back with another Cocoa Vanilla Studio layout using this sketch that I created to scrap these two photos of my youngest daughter staring longingly out of the windows as she wished she could go outside and play, but alas, it is raining. So I'm going to take the Daydream collection on this one, which seems fitting as she stares dreamily out the window. And I have this beautiful mixed media-y looking paper and decided I'm going to cut this down to 9 by 12 because that is the size that I use for my twins albums. And I want to make sure to get those little dashed areas in the center, and I want them to be on the edges of the paper. So I don't want to cut 3 inches off of one side and lose all the dashes on that side. So I'm going to do 1.5 inches off of each side. Then I'm going to add paper layers about, I think it was about 3/4 inch or so, maybe close to 1 inch of this rainbow paper, and then I'll turn it over, realize there's a beautiful yellow stripe on the back, and cut the remaining piece in half to create a smaller strip in the yellow stripe. So then I'll layer those on either side of the layout, creating a bit of a barrier or boundary on either side and narrowing in the focus to the center of the page. Now this is a design that I have used earlier this month on my channel here on YouTube and created another layout with the Daydream collection, but that was on a white cardstock background with bold color strips on the side, and this one has a bold centerpiece with subtle side strips, just to show you a couple of different ways to use this very simple setup to create two very different layouts. So now that I have everything in place, I want to make sure my photos tuck in around those white spots because I feel like those were purposely placed to encourage you to add some embellishment there. I'm going to put one photo up at the top left, one at the bottom right, similarly to how my sketch is set up. Now this is a little higher than it's placed on my sketch, but in my sketch I'm using a 12 by 12. With a 9 by 12 you have to work more vertically because you don't have as much horizontal space. So I really didn't have the opportunity to put them closer together because they would have not left much room for a title. So bringing in some doilies to delineate the area for each of the two photo clusters, and then I'm going to start layering bits and pieces behind them. I have a cut apart rainbow. I'm going to use a couple tags and a journaling spot underneath of the other photo just to give each of them a little bit of a unique design. So they're not going to be completely mirrored. They're just going to have similar elements that flow from one to the other to help them coordinate, but they don't necessarily have to perfectly match. I want the bottom photo to be a little bit more horizontal because it is a horizontal landscape photo, and I want the design of the top photo to be more vertical because it is a portrait photo. I just like the way that that looks, and I think that it works with the shape of the photo instead of trying to work against it. So now that I have this little cut apart rainbow piece here added in, I've decided to add a little heart cluster there where there were some little dash marks in the top right corner of that cut apart, and it just seemed the perfect place to put a small embellishment cluster. Adding in a tag behind this photo, just like in the sketch, and I will glue and tape all of this stuff down off camera, but I wanted to show you how I decide where things get placed. While I am using the sketch, I'm also thinking about nestling things in just the right places. So I've chosen a small title that can perfectly fit in this space between the two photos, just like I had mapped it out on the sketch. Now, if you were doing a 12 by 12 layout, you would have a lot more space between your photos, and you could use a more complicated or longer title in between the two photos. You could even add your journaling in between the two photos. I'm instead working in a 9 by 12, have more limited space in the center, and going to keep my journaling at the bottom and my title minimal. Now I've added my floral cluster there above the photo at the top, again, vertical space, and on the bottom photo that flower arrangement is going to be to the sides, again, horizontal space. So I'm just thinking about how my photos are placed, the shape that they're in, and what kind of design I want on the page. In this case, I'm going a little bit more diagonally. On the other layout that I made using this base design, I went very vertically, straight up and down in the middle of the layout. This one goes more from the top left down to the bottom right. So even though I've used a very simple basic background, I can create so many different styles of layouts, and they will all look completely different even though I just went with a very simple base. So I would encourage you to give this pattern a try and see what you can make on your layout. Both of my layouts included 2 3x4 photos. The first one had 2 3x4 horizontal or landscape photos. This layout had 1 of each. I would love to see your take on this design and this sketch. To see it in more detail or to save it, it is on the Cocoa Vanilla Studio blog, so you can find it there to use it for your own layout. And keep in mind that it is open to interpretation, so you can use it as you see fit. Now, I am adding a couple pieces of flair because I felt like it needed something a little heavier on each of the clusters. You have the florals, which are light and airy. You've got the doily, which is light and airy, and just a couple of ephemera pieces. It really needed something that helped to anchor it onto the page, and I felt like the flair really filled that role. So now I've got a couple of little rainbow pieces I'm going to try to squeeze onto the page, as well as a couple of little word phrases, and that just helps to add a little bit of character onto the embellishment clusters. Now I will go ahead and tape and glue all of this down off camera. I don't really think you need to watch that process. We all know how to tape and glue, so I didn't think I needed to include that, but I did want to leave in the parts where I'm making decisions and changing things so you can kind of see what path my mind took while I was creating this layout. Now I am going to tuck in a few more rainbows here and there amidst the florals just for a little bit of interest, and I think this is just a fun way to break up a floral cluster. If you have a lot of leaves and flowers happening in one spot, you can add small things like these rainbows to break them up and just add a little bit of interest. Now I am going to add a little bit of butterfly movement as well. So I'll add a few butterflies around the page. I think I ended up getting 3 on here, and then I will draw some little trails with Nuvo drops behind them. This creates the impression of movement on the page and helps to guide your eye from the top down to the bottom. So you will see with the placement of my butterflies, it kind of leads you on this winding path from the top left down to the bottom right. So now everything is taped down, and I'm going to bring in some twine for that tag behind the bottom photo. I'm a big fan of putting things into my tags. I don't really like leaving them empty. Let me know if that bothers you. Sometimes I put in twine, sometimes it's just embroidery floss, occasionally an enamel dot or a brad, but I would love to know, do you have to fill in your tags, or do you feel like, nope, they can be empty, totally fine? I'm really curious how common that thought process is. I'm also going to include a little rosette up here at the top left. I tried to squeeze one onto the bottom layout and didn't really feel like it fit in, so just stuck to that one up at the top left, just for fun. Now I'm adding a bunch of little scattering pieces around my clusters. This is a fine detail moment that I do at the end of all of my layouts. In this case, I'm using some teeny tiny little fussy cut florals from the pattern paper. I do love to fussy cut. I find it very relaxing, so a lot of my layouts do feature some sort of fussy cut elements, whether they are cut apart pieces, whether they are florals and butterflies from pattern papers, and sometimes even just the icons like hearts, stars, rainbows, any of those things that I can use to add a little extra embellishing without digging into the embellishments heavily. While I'm adding those around each of the clusters, I'm keeping in mind that I want them to sort of nestle into open spaces. So if there's any little gaps between the leaves, between the florals, between embellishments, I try to fill those gaps with these tiny florals. So just nestling those in to fill the gaps kind of helps it feel more cohesive as a layout. And I look at it a lot like painters who are creating a masterpiece. You begin by putting in your base color. That's your background design. Then you come in with your main elements and get a little bit of detail. That's your photos embellishing. And then you come in with your very fine details, those lines and outlines and shading. And for me, that are the small details that I'm adding, the scattering and the splattering. Now I'm using some Nuvo for some controlled splattering, and then I'll come in with some gold ink for some uncontrolled splattering, and will add lots of random splatters around my clusters to just sort of finish it off. It's a whimsical way to finish the layout and break up a little bit of the more linear aspects. So once I've done with my butterfly trails, I do add just a couple little dots here and there around the clusters with the Nuvo in place of enamel dots. Sometimes I use enamel dots, sometimes Nuvo. They both work well for that purpose. So that's just about it for this layout. If you'd like to see detailed photos and save this sketch for future use, please head over to the Coco Vanilla blog at www.cocovanilla.com.au. I hope you've enjoyed this, and until next time, bye!